Hello, I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. Well, we've revealed our list of 100 notable books of the year. We narrowed those 100 down to a mere 10, and we podcasted about them. And now it's time for our annual Critics Roundtable, in which our daily critics talk about their years in reading. I would like to say we're approaching the limit of books from this year that we can discuss, but as we all know, there are no limits. We could do this all day. So let us bring on our critics. I'm now joined by Dwight Garner. Hello, Dwight.
Hey, Gilbert.
Jen Szalai. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Gilbert.
And Alexandra Jacobs.
Hi, Gilbert.
So, Dwight, you have read a lot of books this year. All three of you have read so many books this year, and the three of you recently published a piece looking back on your year in reading. Dwight, your section was delightfully stylish as always. I could go down the list of all the things you remember, but I would love to start by focusing on three writers that released books this year, people that you characterize as late books from American masters: Richard Ford, Lorrie Moore, and Ann Beattie.
All these three, they're like classic cars, right? Coming down the highway towards you. It's funny, as a book critic, we get to pick just one book a week for each week, and we have better eyes for the things we know. And so as a fiction reviewer, you see the names like Richard Ford and Ann Beattie and Lorrie Moore, and you think, well, I should do that, right? And you can't do too much of that. You need to be on the lookout for new talent, but how can you resist them? And each of their new books were good. I mean, the Richard Ford was the closeout. The novel was called Be Mine. It's the last novel in his Frank Bascom series, which is really just together, they are just a one-of-a-kind series, nearly rank with Updike's Rabbit series of novels in terms of their just grandeur. This new one is the last one, and it's a bit of a falling off. And it makes you think about writers as they age. Martin Amis said that very few writers over 70 write a really first-rate novel. I think this is solid Richard Ford, but not his best. Ann Beattie has a new book of stories called Onlookers that came out this year. And what's interesting about it, and it's very good, is that it's really a portrait of a town. It's Charlottesville, Virginia, where she's lived for a long time. And it's just a look at what it was like to be there during the pandemic and during Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And it's some of her best writing, I think, in quite a while. And finally, Lorrie Moore published this really odd book this year called I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home. And it verges on emo horror. It's about this woman who dies and turns into a tree, and there's almost necrophilia involved. And it's a weird undead love story. But Lorrie Moore is so charming. The problem with Lorrie Moore, God love Lorrie Moore, she's one of my favorite writers. Her short stories are nearly always better than her novels, and this novel is great if you'd like Lorrie Moore, and yet it's not the greatest Lorrie Moore.
Alexandra, you read a ton of fiction this year. I was wondering if you could pick out a few things that you wrote about and wanted our listeners particularly to pay attention to.
I picked up a few fresh-faced younger novelists this year, and the one that sticks out in my memory most recently is Isle McElroy, who did a sophomore fiction called People Collide. And it's about a married couple that switch bodies, which I found was a very intriguing premise. It's like Freaky Friday for the grown-up crowd. And it was really well done. I was very impressed. It's not overfraught the way it's presented. Unlike Freaky Friday, imagine having sex with your spouse, except your spouse's body. I mean, that scene does occur in the novel.
It's not appealing to me. Make it sound more appealing.
Well, let's see. I mean, it's just very well written. It's very well written. And also, the author's non-binary. I think it does play with ideas of gender and just how fixed gender is and the privileges of being a man.
Dwight, you talked a little bit about old masters, but two books I know you were really enthusiastic about this year were from writers that haven't been around that long. I mean, in the case of one, she's been around for a while, but she hasn't written a book in 10 years. These are the books Birnam Wood and Biography of X, both of which had, in addition to you, incredible support from editors on the book review. There are some people that did for both of them, did not like either of them, but there are many people who really loved both. I'd love for you to talk about them.
Yeah, Eleanor Catton's Birnam Wood is in some ways my novel of the year, and it's not really my kind of book. This is going to sound stupid or snobby, but I'm not the biggest plot reader. I'm just not. Like I like sort of thorny, funny, earthy fiction, and if there's no plot, I'm fine with that. But this has a plot like a dream. It just takes right off. And she's such a funny, generous writer that I was just happy from the first time I picked it up. And I don't cry often when I read, but when I do cry when I read, it's rarely because it's emotional. I cry because there's a sense that you can, or I well up, crying's taking it too far, but I well up if there's a sense that a writer gives me that I'm now in your hands. Like you are so clearly in control that I can I'm now just so happy to be here with you. And my critical faculties have somewhat shut off, though I can't entirely. I have to take notes for Christ's sakes. But I felt that way reading this novel. I just really loved it. And Catherine Lacey's novel X is a much more cerebral book. It's about this sort of artist/performance artist. And it's very much about the downtown scene in New York in the 60s and 70s, which, to be honest with you, as a reader, I'm getting a little tired of. Every book seems to fetishize the Patti Smith, Sam Shepard, Lou Reed. It's just been done and done to death. But Catherine Lacey is just a thrillingly cerebral writer, and anything she writes, I will always read.
That was Biography of X was a fascinating book, and Jen, I'd love to get your thoughts on that one if you remember reading it earlier this year, because not only is it this portrait of this artist, it's a portrait of grief because the artist's partner is the one that's trying to write her biography, and it also presents this alternate reality, this alternate history in America where following World War II, the southern states of the United States break off into this overly religious, overly racist, separate nation on its own, and it mixes all three of those things together in a pretty heady way. Jen, did you read this one?
I did, and I really admired it. I mean, it's interesting because talking about those two books, Dwight, I loved Birnam Wood. I think I felt similarly to what you described just now, which is just the sense of being in the hands of a writer who just is so confident and knows what she's doing. And again, I also don't think of myself as necessarily a reader for plot when it comes to fiction, but that novel for me had it all. And Biography of X, I admired, but I found myself, and I mean, maybe this is part of the intention of Catherine Lacey, but I found myself at a remove from the book in a way that I kept getting distracted, not so much by the sort of conceit, the one that you described about this division in this alternate future for the United States, but more where she has the names of contemporary figures, people who are still alive, people who aren't necessarily that famous outside of literary circles, but whose names are recognizable, and they're put in these positions where they're alive at moments that they might not have been alive. And I kept getting distracted by that element, and I could see how she's playing with reality in a way that was really interesting. But yeah, I think there was something about that experience of reading it that felt a little bit distant to me.
There were a lot of Easter eggs for the literati.
There were, and I agree with everything that Jen just said. I felt that with this novel, Lacey upped her game and took her previous novels have been smaller, and you feel like her moving into an almost Delillo-ish vein with this novel that was impressive. I think you're right. I think it's a step up for her, but it's a complicated novel and doesn't work all the time.
As someone who grew up in New York, though not in the 70s, to me there was something that was both appealing about visiting or revisiting that period, which I've experienced through movies and books so many times, and feeling a little bit of the way that you did, Dwight, which is how many times are we going to talk about CBGBs? How many times are we going to talk about... It was the same thing I felt in a different way when I was reading the Madonna biography that Alexandra reviewed. So much of those early years are Madonna in downtown New York.
That's the best part of the book. It's the best part of the book. And when she starts to get famous, when she goes to Hollywood, it starts to go downhill, I think. Not Mary Gabriel's fault. I mean, that's the problem I always have with these biographies and memoirs of famous people. Once they get famous, their lives seem to get less interesting.
I review a lot of biography, and what Alexandra said is so true. I mean, people get famous, and somehow they know fewer people. People aren't as close to them. They have minders, and in every biography, there's always this moment in a great biography. I always hope as a reader, it's within the first 40 pages. I want the subject to be doing what we're reading about by at least 40 pages in. If it's more than that, it's too much for me as a rule. But that 40 page, that part where they discover who they are and why is always the best. And then they first apply it in the world. That next 100 pages is what you care about. And then after that, you're already at cruising altitude, and now you're just cruising.
Dwight, what's your opinion on biographies, the first 3 chapters of which are always, this is who these person's great-great-grandparents were?
Oh, kill me now. I mean, that's important, but it can be done in a few pages.
Didn't someone say, I don't know if this was someone on Twitter or if this is actually someone said this, it said every biography should start when the person gets to New York.
Speaking of New York, Alexandra, one book that you really stumped for this year was The Sullivanians.
I did love The Sullivanians by Alexander Steele. It's flawed, but really marvelous. It's an account of a psychiatric group that became a sort of psychiatric movement that became a social movement and an anti-nuclear family movement originating in the post-World War II period and then really reaching its apex in the 70s, Gilbert, when you weren't around. It's very evocative of the time when people were really questioning the atomic family and really started very well-meaningly with this idea like, oh, you shouldn't be so dependent on your parents. It's unhealthy to be in that hothouse, but really devolving into a kind of free-loving, child-neglecting setup with a lot of questionable real estate deals and very questionable ethical practices in terms of what we now call therapy. And Alexander Steele just really immerses in this world, interviews a lot of the people who survived it. It really was a cult, and a lot of people were harmed. But it's a great book.
I feel like thematically there are parts of that book that dovetail somewhat with one of the books on our top 10 books of the year list, which is The Best Minds by Jonathan Rosen, which we spoke about on last week's podcast, which I believe, Alexandra, you were also a big fan of.
Oh, yeah, I love that book. I mean, The Sullivanians is great, but it can be repetitive in places. It's about a group of people, so it wanders a lot. The Best Minds is very focused on a friendship between the author and Michael Lauder, who was a sort of poster boy for schizophrenia in the 80s, went to Yale Law, and then had a terrible breakdown. And the thing that Rosen, I think, does so effectively is that he branches out to talk about the history of mental illness in the United States and the sort of the way we deal with mentally ill people, the way society copes, and the way we failed them, really. And the way we failed as friends. So it's a very personal memoir of friendship and competitiveness, really. And that's a book that made me cry, actually, because Michael Lauder started his own memoir, and at one point he had a movie deal to write about and so it's really an honorable gesture in a way to finish his story. But it's him winning the competition that they had as children. So it's very rich and a beautiful book.
Do people cry while reading books? Have you?
I mean, I cry a lot. Yes, I do cry.
Okay. And do you cry or do you tear up? I feel like tearing up is what guys of a certain generation say when they're like, I teared up at that. I didn't cry.
Yeah.
My eyes got watery. But
I mean, I don't know about sobbing the way that I sobbed at. There was some Chevrolet commercial with a dementia patient.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Oh my God, it destroyed me. Anyway,
yeah, no.
There's a new Chevrolet ad. If listeners haven't seen it, there's a new 3-minute long Chevrolet ad it
made
killed
Kurt
me.
Anderson cry. I mean, just
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, so no, I don't. I guess I'm not sobbing, but I count tearing up as crying.
I well up. You're right, Gilbert. Rarely will the tear go and roll down my
Rarely
my neck.
does he have to take his handkerchief out and
dab.
And dab.
Jen, Alexandra just talked about one of the books that was on our best of list, which was The Best Minds. And I touched on the next book briefly in last week's episode, but I really want to give you a little bit more runway to talk about Bottoms Up and the Devil Laughs by Carrie Howley.
This was one of my favorite books of the year. And it's also a really strange book. And I would say, on the one hand, it's very, very dark. The subtitle is A Journey Through the Deep State. And so she's writing about essentially the surveillance state that has emerged, especially with the role of big data and collecting the traces of ourselves that we leave online. And then she merges that into the story of Reality Winner, the national security contractor and former linguist who was arrested for sending classified information to The Intercept. And then she connects it to conspiracy theories, to QAnon, as well as this larger question of what it means to construct a self in an era where there is all this information about us that not only was released out into the ether, but it's stored somewhere. And so this idea that we live, I think she has this phrase, something about the age of the indelible. And so things are just kept. And what does that mean? And I have to say that through it all, the book is also really quite funny, like darkly funny, in a way that I think that's the only way that you could really write a book like this and make it hang together, because otherwise it would just be too relentless.
And she does all this in what is one of the shortest books on our top 10 list.
I know. I mean, the book is maybe 200 pages. It's compared to a lot of the books that I tend to read, it's actually quite short. So I was really impressed by what she accomplished here.
Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. Alexandra, we touched briefly on the very large Madonna biography, and for listeners who are not able to catch up with our interview of the author, Mary Gabriel, please go back and give that a listen. But Alexandra, there were so many celebrity biographies and memoirs that came out this fall and this year, really more than I can recall in recent years.
I actually feel my year was not intentionally, but by coincidentally bookended by this Prince Harry's Spare, and then Barbra Streisand's My Name is Barbara. Those were the bookends of my year practically. There's an immersion, and then you come out and you're wet and blinking and dazed, and it's an interesting experience. But really this year it was the biographies and memoirs about or by non-famous people, ordinary people who happen to be in extraordinary circumstances that I thought were actually more memorable to me.
And you were pretty enthusiastic about two in particular.
One excellent book that I think was a contender for top whatever was The Country of the Blind by Andrew Leland. Leland is someone who knows he's going to go blind. He's going blind slowly. And I think the beginning of the book review was something like, you're going to look at being blind differently. You're even going to look at the word look differently. And that's the kind of book this is. It really makes you examine the way language privileges certain senses, like sight. What is it like to not be a sighted person? Maybe hearing is more important than sight. Why do we care more about that? I mean, especially in the age of AI, I think these things are all when images are increasingly suspect, you can't anymore trust what your eyes see necessarily. These are really interesting questions to think about. And Leland, it's not just him describing what's happening to him, it's him considering the history of blindness. I mean, goes back to Homer at least, and blindness in literature, blindness in philosophy, and it's a very multidimensional book.
So that's Country of the Blind by Andrew Leland. There was also Fatherland.
Oh boy. So this is by the New Yorker writer Burkhard Bilger, who found out that his grandfather was a Nazi. And so the book is sort of him researching his grandfather's life and asking the question, is it possible to be a good Nazi, or that his grandfather may have saved some people from worse fates? His grandfather was not sending people to the ovens. Was he a saint? No, but he was a practical, ordinary bureaucrat. Basically, he's humanizing a Nazi, which is a tough thing to pull off.
Tell me why that's something we should do.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I thought the book, it's so well written. I feel like in different hands, you might have thought, why do I care about this one Nazi, in history, this mid-level bureaucrat in this horrible regime? But the fact is, many of us have horrible people in our past. And, especially with like Ancestry.com or DNA and Me, whatever, like you can turn up stuff about your past that is horrifying. And the Burkhard Bilger is really wrestling with what it means to have that in his background. And he just does a beautiful job of writing and researching and talking about his love for Germany, the Fatherland, which is the title of the book. And he pulled it off. That
sounds like an incredible high wire act, and I was not interested in it until you just.
I very much recommend.
Did he pull this off? Is what I need to read it for.
He did pull it off.
Those were two memoirs by non-celebrities. Dwight, I know you, as you often do, reviewed several biographies this year, several of which you thought were pretty masterful.
I did. There's a new biography of Martin Luther King, published by Jonathan Eig, and who'd previously written a biography of Muhammad Ali. And biographies tend to make news to the extent that they have new material in them. And there is new material here. He had access to, Eig did, to a lot of Hoover's wiretaps of MLK over the years, and so a lot of other recordings from the Oval Office, LBJ's presidency. And so he has new material to lean on, and that material matters. But what really matters about this book is that Jonathan Ive can really tell a story, and it's very rich, very textured how he tells Martin Luther King's story growing up in Atlanta, and how he met Coretta Scott King and how he got his career off the ground. And it's all told as if for the first time. He tells you it as if he's writing a novel, and it's just a beautiful story. It's very well told, and like Alexandra and I were saying earlier, the first 150 pages in this case you think are the best, but then in Martin Luther King's case, it even gets weirder and stranger and even better as it goes on, and of course it gets worse. So it's a terrific book. A very different book is Tracy Daugherty's new biography of Larry McMurtry, the of course Lonesome Dove author. And I'll just say the reason this biography is great is that Daugherty is a fine writer, nothing against him, but McMurtry is just so charming and led such a funny life and had such a funny way about him that every anecdote is just hilarious. And it's just a really fun, lively book to read. He was just a character, McMurtry, and it just charmed me, the whole book. Finally, this odd character, Mac McCormick, his full name is Robert Mac McCormick, he's been sitting on this biography of the bluesman Robert Johnson for 50 years. He reported it all decades and decades ago, and no one knew where it went. And it turns out that he turned out to be kind of a bad guy in the end, Johnson. He hoarded all this material, never gave it to other scholars. He was a bad man who profiteered off the Johnson family a bit. So a complicated character. But this book, this biography, it's called Biography of a Phantom, gives you this thing that he wrote 50 years ago before he really screwed up his life. And it's this lovely kind of low-key portrait of a man just trying to chase his idol all across the South. And he knocks on 100 doors and visits barbershops and just trying to get at this music he loves. And the original document is charming, even though it's a complicated thing.
You have occasion to review so many biographies and have read so many more over the course of your career. What are a couple things that you look for when you were writing about a biography?
Oh, man. Well, I just said one of them. By 40 pages, I want to be into, because where the crucial point, right, is the moment when this life diverges from the other lives around it, this person you're reading about. And so I want that to be apparent to me. By about 40 pages, for some reason, is my rule. And I sometimes note it. But of course, it doesn't really matter. Some biographies don't get there that quickly. What else? I like good storytelling. I like it when I sense that the biographer is well read in the literature of their topic. And so I like sort of a critical mind pulling in different stories and what different people have thought about the person under the microscope.
Dwight, you're reminding me of the Roald Dahl biography that I reviewed earlier this year by Matthew Dennison. It beautifully done, elegantly written, maybe a little too respectful of his massive anti-Semitism. It's not that he didn't acknowledge it. It's just that the viewpoint on Roald Dahl has changed so much. But as I think I said in the review, it's like he's too big to cancel because he's generated all these franchises. The books all have spin-offs. The musical, Matilda, like Charlie and Chocolate Factory. It's almost like nobody wants the darkness of his life to be. And he did some amazing things too. I mean, he invented medical devices. He was a brilliant man. But I don't think that biography fully got at the deep, deep anti-Semitism.
I'll say one other thing that matters to me a lot in biography is that you want all the information about one B player in one spot. Let's say that, Gilbert, someone's writing your biography in 30 years. And let's say that I'm a minor character for about 5 years in that book, or 10 years, or 15. But what you want is all of the you want the little portrait of in this case, me, to be all right there and to understand it and not have it just dribble out for 5 different chapters. I hate talking about myself in this way. Yes, Gilbert, please put me in here. It's this art of compacting this portrait of this person who walks into someone else's life and putting it, and you can still add details later, but you want this. Some biographers never give you that. And so the Dwight character in this case will just pop in once in a while. You never get really why he mattered to you. Why do I matter to you?
Dwight, anyway. You get so many chapters.
You're like Kramer,
I'm good at entrances.
Jen, speaking of biographies, one book that you reviewed and were a very large fan of, a somewhat divisive book at the book review, was sort of a group biography. It was a group biography, but it was also a book about, as you write, the nature of reality, which is not intimidating at all. What is this book?
Well, and I do. Okay, so the book is called The Rigor of Angels, and it's by William Egginton. And the 3 main people that he writes about are the Argentine writer Borges, the German physicist Heisenberg, and the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. And so I have to say, first of all, that It's a group biography in that loose sense that some of these books about ideas sometimes are, where, you take 3 figures, 4 figures, and see how their ideas shape one another's thought. And so in this instance, Borges and Heisenberg are approximately contemporaries in the 20th century, even though they're not necessarily interacting with one another. But Immanuel Kant is from a couple of centuries before. And so what Eginton does that I thought was really original is that he looks at a question that I think has preoccupied a lot of people, a lot of writers, which is this question of reality. What is it? How do we understand it? Can anybody really have a comprehensive understanding of it? And explores that question through the life and thought of these 3 people who were looking at it from very, very different perspectives. But ultimately, what he says that they share is that none of them felt this need or ability to understand the totality of the world around us, that there really was built into their project this idea that we can only really have a sense of a sliver of what we're looking at, depending on what we're focusing on at a given moment. And that this really has huge implications, I think, for a lot of things. It has implications for how we interact with one another, with the assumptions we make. And I just love this book. It's also beautifully written. It's very elegant. And I think that when you're dealing with a subject like this, I think there's a lot of pressure on the writing. Eginton really rose to the occasion. And it's one of those books that I feel like the questions that it raises, I keep thinking about, and it keeps coming up for me. But I will also say that for a book about reality, understandably, it was really divisive, as you pointed out in The Office. I think that there were some people who, like me, felt it was really valuable and generative, and then other people who I think also understandably felt that there was something about it that was just off-putting.
Yeah, why are you trying to mess with my mind? I don't need to think about the nature of reality. You also did a profile, as we talked about on the podcast earlier this year, of Naomi Klein. And I feel like the book that she wrote this year in its own way, and maybe we touched on this during that conversation, also tried to deal somewhat with the nature of modern reality and how truth and the internet and how this all sort of intersects in a way that can make it difficult to understand what is real and what is not.
So her book was called Doppelganger, and it starts off sort of as a memoir of her own experience during the pandemic and this issue, I guess you could call it, that she's been dealing with since before the pandemic, but it really came to the fore during the pandemic, which is apparently the fact that a lot of people, especially online, confuse Naomi Klein for Naomi Wolf. And Naomi Wolf, for listeners, is an author who probably is most famous for The Beauty Myth, which came out in the early 90s, known for her feminist scholarship, but also within the last few decades has drifted, and especially during the pandemic. I mean, now she is talking about things like the problem with vaccines and the way she argues, Naomi Wolf argues that the government has used COVID to take away people's freedoms. And so Klein, who very much is a woman of the left, very much into vaccines and public health, is understandably upset and is trying to understand what has happened, not just to her own experience, but also trying to look at how that connects to our general experience of this sort of fragmentation of reality and understanding, and how that's really hard for solidarity, which, as a woman of the left, she thinks is really important.
Now, we're in the final weeks of the year. It's December. How do you each spend those final weeks? Are you reading old stuff? Are you reading new stuff? Are you not reading at all? We'll start with Dwight.
I'm reading Edmund Wilson's, this is going to sound so pretentious, but actually it's reverse pretentious because I'm reading Edmund Wilson's diaries. And I started with the 50s, then I read the 60s, then I went back to the 20s, now I'm reading the 30s. I've only the 40s left. But here's my pitch for these diaries. They're just so, I'm not a philosophical, I don't think, reader. Ideas, I just trust ideas a little bit and give me earthiness, give me brains, but I bring on life. And Edmund Wilson just had a big, crazy life. It's all about sex and traveling and the people he knew and airplane trips in the 1930s. And it's just fantastic. I've just written a book about food and reading, and I still am going to read cookbooks all for the next month. So mark me down for reading cookbooks.
I was going to say, Dwight, just having finished your book, that food and sex and travel and all the great things in life are definitely something that clearly have a central place in your soul as you convey in the Upstairs Delicatessen. Alexandra, how do you spend the last few weeks of your year as a book critic?
Well, I just finished a book that I really was surprised to love by a guy named Christian Wyman, who's at the Yale Divinity School, and he's a poet, but also sort of a theologian. And he writes about the stuff that Jen was talking about, except from a religious viewpoint. And it's not my religion, and Dwight, as I think you noted in one of your reviews of his earlier books, he's a believer. And if you're not a believer, then you might think, oh, this is challenging, or I don't even want to read this. But he's a poet, and he cites a tremendous amount of poetry, and it's almost like a commonplace book of poetry. There's so much poetry in there. And I just found it amazing the way he found common ground with philosophy and again, those sort of questions of like, what is reality? He had cancer. Did I mention he had cancer?
Right, I was going to ask you about that. How is he doing?
Well,
he's had it for a long time.
He's had it for a long time. And that's the other thing. I mean, I have a friend or two either facing cancer in their lives, as many of us do. And I just think his writing about cancer reminded me of Barbara Ehrenreich's. It's not sentimental. It's not goopy. It's not shiny brochures like everything's going to be okay, pink ribbons and all that. And he seems to be doing well. I don't actually know, but he writes about the particular pain of cancer in a way that I think is just a tremendous gift to people. And that's I hate it when people say gift, but like that about writing. But nonetheless, that is a book I would actually give to people as we are in this festive holiday season. And I'm also going to be cleaning out my mother's chest of segue from Dwight. She has a lot of old cookbooks, and I think I'm going to be writing a piece about the joy of vintage cookbooks. I actually don't cook, so it may be something of a humor piece. But I want to write about like why these books are appealing. Why is it fun to look at these old glazed dishes? and why is it fun to read about what people used to eat? So you can look forward to that.
Oh boy, you're on the hook now. I'm looking forward to that. Jen, how are you planning to spend the last few weeks of your year?
Well, I'm hoping to finally see some movies again, which I feel like is maybe what I said last year.
Have you seen Barbie yet?
Oh, yeah. I've seen Barbie. I've seen Oppenheimer.
Maestro.
Oh,
let's go see Maestro.
Yes.
Yeah.
We should.
It's a date. We're going to Maestro.
And so I feel like I said this last year where now that they've been opening up for a while now, that I would try to go to the theater more rather than just not go to the theater, essentially. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I haven't made good enough on that resolution from last year. So that's one of the things I'd like to do.
Alexandra, what should Jen see?
Merrily We Roll Along.
That's what I was going to say, and I haven't seen it.
It's superb.
Yeah. Well, the tickets now are going to be $300. Right?
You know what I did? I have a tip. You buy singles. Don't sit with your family. Or buy singles, and
then you get a bargain.
You get a bit of a bargain, and you know what? You don't have to sit with your family.
What are you going to do? Talk to them during
exactly. I mean, honestly, especially the children can have a more pure experience if you're not looking at them.
I guess that's true. And currently, actually, just this weekend, I started reading. I don't read a ton of self-help, but I will say that I occasionally like to read a self-help book just to.
You don't need any help, Jen.
Oh, come on. We all need help. I mean, thank you, though. But I do. So I'm reading this book called 4,000 Weeks. Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman, which is
I like
very
him. He's the Guardian writer.
Yeah, and I feel like it is one of those books. It's like self-help for people who feel a little bit hesitant about self-help. And he talks about how we should look at the 4,000 weeks that on average we might have on this earth. That's 4,000 weeks if you live to 80.
That's it?
I know. I know. He says that most people overestimate wildly. Like when he asks how many weeks you think that people on average have in the Western world, people will say like 300,000.
I'm so depressed.
So anyways, but Don't be depressed. He tells you not to be depressed. So in any case, I will say that so far what I'm getting, I'm about halfway through the book. And, he does talk about that one of the things about this sort of fetish that we have for time management and different forms of time management and finding the right productivity hack, finding the right planner, that is just a way of distracting ourselves from, of course, the big questions.
You're writing about this, I hope.
I mean, this book came out a couple of years ago, so no, but I feel like it all goes into the well and maybe it'll bubble up in some other form. Does he mention the
Pomodoro method that everyone was...
I think in passing. The book essentially starts off by saying there are all these methods. They're all just a distraction from really the big questions, which is mortality and how we spend our time and what is meaningful and how difficult it is to think about those things.
That's exactly what Christian Wyman is writing about too.
There you
it's
go,
fantastic.
Since we talked about Oliver Burkeman, who's great, let me pivot. Gilbert, what are you doing with your final?
Oh, yeah.
Well, meaningful to me is talking to all of you.
Oh.
Yeah.
But additionally meaningful is doing a little of what Jen talked about and trying to catch up on movies, which is, again, probably the same answer I gave last year. But there's a new Alexander Payne movie. There's a new movie from Yorgos Lanthimos starring Emma Stone called Poor Things that I'm very much looking forward to. Catch up on movies. And then reading books that I have no reason to read for work. Liz Egan, one of our editors, a couple weeks ago in our newsletter, Read Like the Wind, wrote about the epistolary book 44 Charing Cross Road, which I have never read. I've always wanted to read that. I just have piles of books at home. I would love to pick up a book for no reason at all and read it. So I'm going to do some of that. But I did mean what I said. I so enjoy talking to all of you, and I'm really grateful that you all appeared on this week's episode. Thank you, Dwight.
It was fun.
Alexandra.
It was great.
Jen.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That was my year-end conversation with our staff critics, Dwight Garner, Alexandra Jacobs, and Jen Szalai. I hope we talked about a book that sounds interesting to you. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.